We are going to learn about the closure in JavaScript along with the lexical environment. Without the understanding the scope or the lexical environment, we cannot get the concept for the closure. It is the most of the in most of the interview question, this question has been asked, what is the closure in JavaScript? So closure is a very good concept which we see in our most of the times whenever we write the code. So basically closure is nothing but a combination of a function and its lexical environment within that function was declared. So we will understand what is the closure by taking one of the example, and along with the first we will write one example for the lexical environment, and then we will understand the how the closure works. So let's see one of the example. So suppose we have to write one function as a you can say something like a function get name, or you can say get channel name. You can write anything. I'm just taking one example where I would be declaring one name and will give as a code breaker as a channel name, and then inside this we will declare one of the method function show, and then here we will try to access this the name. You can see, right? So what is the lexical environment? Lexical environment for this method is the name and this method, and here at the end we are trying to call the inner method. So inner method is trying to access the variable which is present outside the method. So this is considered as a whole of the lexical environment. Any of the value which has been written inside the method and the inner method is trying to access it, we can say it's kind of a lexical environment of this method is trying to lexical environment of this scope is trying to access the inner method where this variable is being shared by the inner method. So, as you have read, right? So any of the variables which has been written, so generally we say the lexical and any of the variable which is written inside this method would be accessible to this environment. So this is kind of a lexical environment for this method where we are trying to access the value of the outer method, we can say. So this method is accessible, is trying to access the name value, and then if you try to call this method like get channel name, then you can see, right, what it will print. So if I run this code, so you can see, right, it is trying to access the name which is present to this environment and is returning the value as a code breaker as a channel name. So suppose you can say like this is like a grandparent and this is their children, where children is asking something from their grandparents and they are able to access the they are able to get those data. So similar way, suppose what will happen, so let's understand. Suppose here outer variable of this for this method is easily accessible since the inner method is able to access this value. But suppose if any of the value, suppose if I declare let data 10, and now if I try to access this value console.log data, so you can see, then if I try to run this code, we'll get the error. Why? Because inner method value cannot be accessed by the outer method. Due to that we are getting the error. So in general you can say, right, one example as a jokingly you can say, right, so grandparents whatever they have they can give it to their children, but children things is not being given to the grandparents. So they cannot take their children, grandchildren data or any of the things to their grandparents. It's like one common example I am saying. You can consider as a one of the logic where inner method of the show method is not accessible by the outer methods, but inner method can access the any of the data which is present to the outer method. So you can say, right, so this is kind of a lexical environment where which is for this get channel name, where the inner method is trying to access the value for the outer methods. So now what I will do, I will remove this console log dot data and this data. So this is about the lexical environment actually. So now if you see, right, if I come to the example for the function closure, there is nothing change. It's just like we would be returning this method. Now returning of this method is nothing but the returning whole lexical environment of this method. And when we try to access this value, right, so in order to get the data of this function, you can say this method as a function closure by putting the return value for the show method. So if we try to write the data, so suppose let result and try to access this method, it will return whole lexical environment of this method while calling this method. So if you print, right, and here you can change name, console.name, accessing, you can say console.log function closure, and you will be seeing that it is accessible because this return show is just returning the whole lexical environment for this method. Due to that reason only we are able to access, and this concept is known as a function closure. So you can say this is the lexical environment of this whole scope, and return show is kind of a function closure where it is returning the show method along with the whole lexical environment of this scope for this get channel method. And if we try to access this method, we can easily access this value. So suppose if you try to access any of the data outside this method, suppose you can say console.log name, which is not in the lexical environment. As you can see, right, Visual Studio is already saying you cannot access this value. Name is declaration mark as a depreciated, but yeah, here I am trying to access this name, and if I try to run this code, right, I think it's taking something else. Okay, let me change this to something else. Name 1, sorry, name 1. And if you try to access this value, you will get error because this is not into this whole environment. Any of the variable of the inner of the method, if you try to access this outside the scope, you will get the error. But if you have some inner method and if you try to return that method which is considered as a lexical scope of this environment for this method, it would be easily accessible by calling this method, right? So this concept is known as a function closure where outer variable are accessible by the inner methods and to that particular lexical environment. So you can say simplified definition as a closure is a function that can access and remembers the variables which is present to the outer function, and even outer function has a finish execution where it will execute and it will get the data from the outer function, and it can be easily accessible by the inner methods. And when you call this method, it will return the result whichever the whatever the variables or whatever the method is trying to perform. So yeah, so that is all for the function closure. Let's meet to the next video. Thank you.